Hello, everyone from Arizona. This is Drew Norman giving you Chapter 18, a chapter we didn't get to cover at all in person, so I figured I would go over it today, even though I'm out of town and really tired. Anyway, so Chapter 18, the sectional crisis is renewed, building up toward the Civil War. First, we have the issue of popular sovereignty. Democrats in, that should say 1848, Polk had pledged to serve a single term, so he steps down. Democrats stay silent on slavery and turn to a guy named Lewis Cass. Cass pushed the idea of popular sovereignty. This idea was that people of each territory should determine the status of slavery. In other words, if you lived in a new state, that state should be allowed to vote on whether or not it allowed slavery. People tended to like it because it sounded really democratic and seemed to match American ideals. Politicians liked it because they said, hey, I don't have to decide, the people will decide. And then, of course, you have it becoming a local and not national issue. So they felt like this would handle the issue of slavery pretty well. Just let each local area decide, let the people decide there, and then everyone else can kind of just ignore it. This seemed like an easy solution, but fear that slavery would soon spread around the rest of our country led to the creation of a group called the Free Soilers. So the Free Soil Party, to continue on with that theme, was organized by a lot of anti-slavery Northerners who embraced aid for improvements and free homesteads, among other things. But their main, in other words, those improvements would have been lined up with the previous Whig ideology. The problem is that there's a lot of Southerners who don't agree with them. So the Free Soil Party ends up dividing the two political parties. In this, you see that Van Buren was chosen to run for them in 1848 by the Free Soil Party. He tried to get the what they called the conscience Whigs, or the Whigs of the North, who disagreed with slavery, and also those who were expansionists and manufacturers who wanted lower tariffs. All this to say, the Free Soilers divided the parties that already existed. Meanwhile, the Whigs themselves nominated a guy named General Zachary Taylor. With his success in the Mexican American War, and with his ability to completely avoid all of the issues, Taylor was really a popular candidate. So, with all that said, Taylor is able to win because of his wartime success and because Van Buren was dividing the other parties, especially the Democrats, who had their northern slave supporter or free soilers divided between themselves and the Southerners that supported slavery. So after that election is over in 1848, gold is discovered in California. When gold is discovered, tens of thousands rush to California. Now, we could go into a lot of details about this, but the main thing to remember about it is that people continue to move west for economic opportunity. Most of the time it's land, but in this case it's gold. But the biggest reason we remember the establishment of California is because they are able to quickly write a state constitution because tens of thousands rush out there. And so by 1849, when they're applying for statehood, they decide to exclude slavery. The issue with that is that's going to cause a division in Congress over whether they should allow it, because this will throw off the slave-free balance. If you remember all the way back in the Missouri Compromise, we had the decision to allow Missouri in as a slave state, and that was balanced by Maine being added as a free state. So this is going to divide our country even more. And currently in 1850, the South is doing pretty well. They had a president, they had a majority in the cabinet and the Supreme Court, and including Congress. Cotton was expanding and very profitable, but for some reason they were constantly afraid of losing slavery. And so when they see the potential 15 to 15 slave to free state equilibrium ruined, with California giving free states an advantage, that leads to some serious issues. Governors in New Mexico and Arizona had also pushed for no slavery, meaning that they were afraid that they would have less and less power in Congress, and eventually slavery would be done away with because of that lack of balance. Combine this with how upset Southerners were about runaway slaves. In the Constitution, runaway slaves were supposed to be returned to the Southern states, or, well, at that point, states that owned slaves. By this point, however, the South is the only area that owns slaves. So the problem was many northern states had accepted runaway slaves and allowed them to live there freely, and this went against that constitutional agreement. Of course, you know the story of Harriet Tubman, who led the Underground Railroad, seeing thousands escape with its chief conductor, Harriet Tubman, leading them there. She was not the only one; many others joined in it. Ohio became a popular place for religious reasons, to help them escape and to give them safety. And many others also ran to Canada for permanent freedom since Canada did not have slavery. So even though abolitionists did not profit from the Underground Railroad, they helped nearly 1,000 a year escape. But when you think about it, 1,000 out of 4 million really isn't that much. So Southerners were in many ways afraid and angry about the Underground Railroad without much just cause towards their overall institution of slavery. And here's a picture of Harriet Tubman and some others that she helped run away. Here's a little door on the Underground Railroad where they would have hidden some runaway slaves. So this brings us to those two things that are making the South both anxious and angry: the protection of runaway slaves in the Underground Railroad, and also the lack of balance between free and slave states coming up. So in 1850, when California was admitted as a free state, quote, fire eaters planned a national meeting to secede from the U.S. So as early as 1850, Southern states, with their fear that slavery is going to be done away with by Congress, they are already talking about secession. So this leaves three, a mortal trio, as your textbook puts it: Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, who had been in Congress for a very long time, and they are able to create a compromise between the three, or between the two sides. So Clay is the main one who is the driving force behind this. Calhoun and Webster were on opposite sides of the debate. But with that said, let's talk about the actual compromise they create. This is more about the debate. William Seward, who pushed God's moral law, saying that Northern congressmen should uphold the compromise. President Taylor was bent on vetoing it. He died, which actually enabled Millard Fillmore, who supported the compromise and allowing slavery to continue. So with this said, let's talk about what is the Compromise of 1850? Concessions to the North. What did the North get in this compromise? Well, they got California added as a free state, and they also had the territory disputed by Texas and Mexico was going to be given to New Mexico. And they also got the abolition of slave trade in D.C. But slavery actually stayed in Washington, D.C. They just could not have people on the auctioning block there, so that would look bad. But they still kept slavery there. Okay, so that's what the North got, a few things there. And then what did the South get? They got the remainder of the Mexican cession would become New Mexico and Utah, and the slave status for those territories would be chosen by popular sovereignty, not chosen by Congress. Number 2, Texas receives $10 million for New Mexico territory that they had to give up. And number 3, a more stringent fugitive slave law is created. So when we look at this compromise, the two major things to remember is what the North got. The main one is California was added as a free state. And the concessions to the South, what did they get? They got a more stringent or strict fugitive slave law. So looking at what life looked like after 1850 or from this compromise, you see free states by admission to the Union. You see the slave states that existed. And so you can see a nation clearly divided between those two sides. So who actually wins the compromise? Well, based upon the two major aspects that I just informed you about, the North was able to tip the balance of free states to slave states. New Mexico and Utah were open to popular sovereignty and more than likely would have chosen to be free because the environment itself didn't favor slavery. What about the South? Why did they not win? Well, they may have halted abolition in D.C., but they needed new territory for slavery. They simply gave up too much in this compromise to keep or to create a fugitive slave law. The North now had control, if they had ever chosen to do so, to get rid of slavery or control the decision making because of the free state balance. And the South really got a law that was never going to be enforced strongly by the North. They could not enforce them to enact and protect or force runaway slaves to be returned. So this compromise does delay the war through the 1850s, giving the North an advantage in many ways. But with that said, this compromise was won by the North because of that free state balance. So what was the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850? Well, it's something that simply made the North angrier than they had been before. That stirred massive northern opposition. Fleeing slaves were denied a trial and could not witness. So in other words, if you were a slave who had run away, you did not get a trial. You could not bear witness for yourself. So it was very difficult for you to prove your innocence. Or if you were a free black man and were captured and accused of being a runaway slave, you couldn't actually testify for yourself. Federal commissioners, so this is like basically the judges who decided whether they were a runaway slave or not, they're actually going to be paid double if they said that this accused person was a runaway rather than set free. In other words, paid twice to say that you were a runaway slave who needed to be returned. This gave them, unfortunately, kind of a motivation to choose that blacks put on trial would be runaways, and whether or not that was true. Northerners who did not, or rather, Northerners that helped runaways were subject to heavy fines or jail time. So you can see all these law, or the fugitive slave law puts in all of these actions and punishments for those who would help runaway slaves. Massachusetts, because of this, they actually made enforcing the law illegal. Imagine that, a law that made another law illegal to be enforced. That just shows you how upset they were. Other states passed personal liberty laws that if someone is freed, you can't force them to go back into slavery. Personal liberty. The Underground Railroad also picked up steam throughout this time period. Southerners were infuriated the North would not enforce the law. So the one thing that they got from the compromise that really was a lasting part of it for them, or at least they thought it would be, was not at all enforced. So really, they gained nothing. So in 1852, continuing the political theme, the Democrats choose dark horse Franklin Pierce. He was a weak and indecisive leader, but he was pro-South. And so, because he was pro-South and was from the North and had no enemies, he was easily able to win. The Whig Party, however, was split. So this is about to be the death of the Whig Party. They were created following Jackson splitting the Democratic Republicans, led by Henry Clay. But it is the issue of slavery that will lead to their undoing. Winfield Scott was supported by Northern Whigs, but the South doubted his loyalty to the defense of slavery. And so because of that, they are able to get a victory. The Whig Party will die because the Free Soil Party, mostly made up of Northerners who opposed slavery, would simply not agree with Southerners who, even if they had the same economic ideas for the American system and building infrastructure, they would never agree on the issue of slavery. And so the Whig Party will die following the 1852 election over the next few years. And Democrats are able to have another president in Franklin Pierce. Which brings us to some other areas. So we see America divided by the issue of slavery. How does that impact our international affairs? Manifest Destiny was revived by the 1848 Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. What this did is it said that America and Britain would not mess with areas to the south of America. Neither the U.S. nor Britain would seek to fortify or control future Isthmian waterways. In other words, what will later become the Panama Canal. We agreed that neither one of us would try to control it. Now the more interesting part. Southerners tried many different ways to extend slavery further south. Amongst them was an adventurer named William Walker, who actually tried to take over the entire country of Nicaragua on his own, just so he could gain control of it and then spread slavery in northern territory. But in his attempt to capture Nicaragua, he ended up being executed by a firing squad, so he failed in that attempt. Another way that Southerners tried to extend slavery was that they tried to take over Cuba. Polk himself had offered $100 million when he was president to purchase it. Franklin Pierce suggested war over it. And so during Franklin Pierce's presidency, in something that was known as the Austin Manifesto, an agreement was made between Pierce and several of his cabinet members that if Cuba would not accept, or rather if Spain would not accept $120 million for Cuba, that we would declare war on them to capture it. However, once this plan was leaked to the public, many Northern Free Soilers were very angry, and Pierce was forced to pull back his attempt to capture Cuba. But it's still rather interesting that we see the South looking to, if they can't expand slavery west in New Mexico, Arizona, or California, then by golly, they're just going to have to do it in foreign territory. Which brings us to other dealings that America had. We'll talk more about American imperialism and international dealings in future chapters, but this kind of lays the groundwork for our extension of influence into the Asian region. Britain had fought the Opium War, taking control of Hong Kong, but meanwhile, all President Tyler wanted, was trade with China. One man was sent in 1844 to sign a commercial treaty with them, and that is the first time we have trade official commercial trading with the Chinese. Beyond that, we also send Commodore Matthew Perry in the 1850s to Japan. Japan was a secluded country who refused to deal with anybody, but when we came rolling up with technology that struck fear into the Japanese, we were able to basically force them to trade with us in what we call the Treaty of Kanagawa. Anyway, so and the opening when we open Japan up to trade, this actually creates a push for them that leads to a completely change in their culture and their government, and will bring them into the modern world, which unfortunately will also lead them to expand and lead us to conflict in the Pacific in World War II. Furthermore, what else were we trying to do? What other international deals were we trying to make? Mexican-American War had brought awareness to weak continental travel. Surprisingly, the South is finally able to see that we need to have infrastructure. The Continental Railroad seemed like the only solution, and so Southerners were able to secure the Gadsden Purchase in 1853, potentially to build a railroad across the Southern Territories, because that would actually get around the dangerous mountains. The problem is Northerners did not want a transcontinental railroad built in the South. And so that leads us to a guy named Stephen Douglas creating the Kansas-Nebraska scheme. He wanted his home state of Illinois to be the launching point of the Transcontinental Railroad. And so Stephen A. Douglas, what he does is he proposes Nebraska be divided into two territories. Slavery in those two territories would then be chosen by, you guessed it, popular sovereignty. He assumed Kansas, which to the south would be the slave state, and Nebraska to the north would be free. The problem is that this went completely against that 3630 line. As you can see on this map, all of Nebraska territory before it was divided was above the line that said that everything should be free. So he had to convince Congress to support his plan. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the problem with it is that in order to pass it and to allow for the building of the Transcontinental Railroad in the north, he convinced Southerners to open up all that territory, or he convinced everyone to open up the territory of Nebraska and Kansas to popular sovereignty. The problem is nobody really liked it. It did nothing but really ruin every compromise our country had made, infuriating anti-slaverites across the country. And so this helps lead to the emergence of the Republican Party. Beginning in the Middle West, it gathered people from all the different parties that simply did not support slavery. And this will, well, unfortunately be the beginning of the end for the American Union. Okay, thanks for joining me. I hope I can see you guys at some point soon. Take care.